Okay, good afternoon, folks. This is Dr. Weiss, and today I'm going to be discussing Abraham Cahan's The Imported Bridegroom. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the historical context, which we've been talking about all semester, a little bit about Cahan's life. Abraham Cahan was an important writer of the late 19th and early 20th century because he was an immigrant. He was fairly well educated and was able to articulate the immigrant experience, and he was also an important Jewish writer. He wrote both in English and in Yiddish, and Yiddish is sort of a combination of German with some Hebrew and more modern languages mixed in. It's still spoken a little bit today, but let's get started on Abraham Cahan. So Abraham Cahan was born in 1860, in the middle of the 19th century, and he immigrated to the United States about 1880, 1882 or so. He was a Lithuanian-born Jewish American author, and in this country, he became a socialist leader. Now, oftentimes today we think of socialism as, the idea of socialism is changing to some degree. There are certain aspects of world history, of American history, that we think of socialism as something bad. There are elements of socialism in the United States and the United States government in terms of the kinds of products, let's say, that the American government supplies to its citizens. But Lithuania was under communist rule in Russia in the 19th century, and it gained independence right after World War I and was reestablished as a democratic nation. 19th century Russia was a tough place. Russia was far behind other European countries in terms of technology, in terms of elevating. In Russia, it would be called the serfs, the peasantry class, serfs that are working land that they do not own, educational opportunities, and all sorts of different social and institutional issues which were fairly oppressive. Now, the history of Russia in the 19th century was one that went back and forth, whether it's Alexander the First or Alexander the Second, who was actually assassinated for trying to instill or change government to allow more opportunity and more of a kind of equality between the classes and things like that. But 19th century Russia was behind European technology, was behind Europe in many ways socially, and they went through a rapid period of industrialization towards the end of the 19th century. And whether it's Russia or in other parts of the world, other parts in world history, when a country or a culture goes through rapid change, whether it's socially or religiously or technologically, often there is social upheaval to a greater or lesser degree. We add on that Abraham Cahan was Jewish, and the Jewish people did not have their own homeland. There were Jewish people in Russia and all throughout Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Abraham Cahan was a part of the later waves of Eastern European and Russian immigrants that came to the United States. He was an editor of the Yiddish newspaper, the Jewish Daily Forward, and he was a very prolific writer. As I said, he wrote both in English and in Yiddish, and he wrote for audiences that spoke both English and Yiddish, some mainstream magazines, as well as magazines that were more suited or targeted for a Jewish and Yiddish-speaking audience. So he immigrated to the United States in 1882, and as I said, also he was a dedicated socialist. He believed in everybody getting an equal part of the pie. Okay, so Kahane fled the mass roundups of revolutionaries after the assassination of Alexander II in Russia. We spoke just a few moments ago about the conditions in Russia, and they were not particularly favorable to a variety of people, including Jewish people. And thus, there were a large number of Jewish people like Kahane, like many other Europeans and other Russians, other ethnic groups within the Russian Empire that emigrated to the United States. He settled on the Lower East Side of New York along with other Jewish immigrants, and we talked earlier on in the semester about this idea of the ghetto, and we associate that with poor people or lower socioeconomic group. But a ghetto was a place of racial, sometimes racial and ethnic cohesion. So when people immigrated from other places, they wanted to immigrate to a community that was established, and these were called ghettos. He was fluent in Yiddish as well as in English, and like many immigrants, came to this country without speaking English and essentially taught himself how to speak English. Known as being the first prominent writer to emerge from the biggest wave of Jewish immigration from Russia. He was an important Jewish writer. He was an important immigrant writer, and as I've said in the past, it's the specificity of the ethnic or racial group is important to a degree, to a certain extent. What is more important is the immigrant experience, and most immigrant experiences, to a greater or lesser extent, have similarity together. So it doesn't matter if you are not Jewish or not Syrian, or you aren't from Northern Africa, let's say from Algeria. Stories of immigration are very similar to one another, have similar elements, similar challenges, and as a reader, I think we can see ourselves in these stories. Some of the themes that Cahan wrote about: how to find Jewish meaning in a complex world. He explored the social, cultural, and spiritual tensions of the Eastern European Jewish immigrant experience in New York. And this idea of Jewishness and Americanism, issues of accommodation and acculturation. And again, we spoke about Edith Maud Eaton, half Chinese, half British, new identity coming to America. These transformations of identity, evolving from one kind of person into another, and the desire to embrace new identity, and also the desire to barricade or keep boundaries up to transformation to new identity in the hopes of keeping stability of yourself, the stability of the old self. And we're going to see this play out in The Imported Bridegroom in the character of Azriel. So Kahane was a prolific writer of newspaper articles and short stories. Two novels that he wrote, which gained him some critical acclaim, was Yekel, A Tale of the New York Ghetto, and that was published in 1896, and then The Rise of David Levinsky in 1917. And the image that I have for you in the lower right hand, on the right hand side, was by William Dean Howells, who wrote The Rise and Fall of Sivath Latham, an important American writer of the late 19th century, and he wrote, he was an admirer of Andrew Cahan. So this sort of tells you, we might not be familiar with William Dean Howells, but he was a very famous, a very well-known, respected writer, American writer of the 19th century, and he was speaking and was an admirer of Abraham Cahan. Okay, let's start looking at the text. Again, I am in the Heath Anthology of American Literature, Volume C, late 19th century, 1865 to 1910. I am on page 898, The Imported Bridegroom. Let's look at the opening sequence, what the author is telling us in the beginning of this story. Flora was alone in the back parlor, which she had appropriated for a sort of boudoir. She sat in her rocker in front of the parlor stove, absorbed in Little Dorrit. Her well-groomed, girlish form was enveloped in a kindly warmth whose tender embrace tinged her interest in the narrative with a triumphant consciousness of the snowstorm outside. So what is it that we are told in the opening sequence? Well, first of all, we notice, I think, her name, Flora, which means really flower, plant life. Immediately we are told that, and we're going to get further description of this, that Flora is a beautiful young girl. What does the word appropriated mean? Appropriated means to take something, maybe even something that was not yours. So this is maybe a precocious young girl living in a patriarchal society. She knows what she knows, she wants what she wants, and she wanted this area in the back parlor, and she took it. So I would suggest to us that Flora is an independent young woman exhibiting some woman strength. She is reading Little Dorrit. This is a Charles Dickens novel published in 1855. It is a kind of criticism on society. It's about prisons and money and the death of a father. And we get the sense that Flora is not flighty, not an airhead. She's a precocious, intelligent young lady who has more of a refined taste. 2 paragraphs down. She was the only girl of her circle who would read Dickens, Scott, or Thackeray, in addition to the family story paper and the Fireside Companion, which were the exclusive literary purveyors to her former classmates at the Christie Grammar School. There were a piano and a neat little library in her room. Further, we are told that she is a learned reader. She's reading these texts that other people that she circulates with does not read. Let's continue. She was rather tall and well-formed. Her oblong ivory face, accentuated by a mass of unruly hair of a lusterless black, was never deserted by a faint glimmer of a smile, at once pensive and arch. When she broke into one of her hearty, good-natured laughs, her deep, dark, appealing eyes would seem filled with grief. And then there's some additional description. That she is well-formed, meaning, I think, that she is at a point in time where she's beginning to develop physically into this young woman. And what I think is important here is that we're not told this immediately. These aren't the sorts of descriptions we are told about Flora, that it's about her body. It's about her developing into what's later going to be, in terms of maturation, a sexual body, a body that is desired. Rather, we are told first about her mind. We also have some exotic qualities here that mark her as separate. First of all, separate from the group of girls that she might circulate with in terms of her intelligence and the things she likes to read, but also that her hair is unruly, which represents, I think, that rebellious quality of youth. And this rebellious quality of youth is going to be pitted against the traditionalism of her father, who is very, as we might say today, very old school. I am on page 899, second paragraph. A matchmaker had recently called, and he had launched into a eulogy of a young Jewish physician. But old Struan, Flora's father, had cut him short in his blunt way. His only child was to marry a God-fearing businessman, and no fellow deep in Gentile lore and shaving his beard need apply. This is Flora's father's desire for his daughter. And so things are sort of divided into things that are acceptable to Azrael as a renewed traditionalist in Jewish culture, and things that are Gentile. Things that are Gentile are, it's not really a pejorative term, it just means not Jewish. So we have a world of Jewishness and a world of not Jewishness. And that world of not Jewishness, I think we can also substitute as American. But both of these things, Gentile, the condition of being Gentile, meaning not Jewish, and being Jewish, these are both under the umbrella of being American. In very traditional terms, a parent might bring a matchmaker and try to find a spouse for your son or daughter that is either within the same socioeconomic group or maybe try to find a match in a higher socioeconomic group. Now, Azrael has a lot to offer, and we get the sense throughout the story that they are fairly well off. He's in business, he's a landlord, he's made a lot of money. The question for him is not about wealth, it's about something else that we will get to. As this paragraph continues, as to Flora, she was burning to be a doctor's wife. A rising young merchant, a few years in the country, was the staple matrimonial commodity in her set. So finding somebody, a young merchant, was something that's what lots of people did in her circle of friends, in her social circle. That's not what she wanted. She wanted to find a doctor, somebody that was elevated in society, a man of learning, but a different kind of learning than the kind that, let's say, Azrael is interested in for his daughter. At the bottom of that paragraph, but apart from this, she craved a more refined atmosphere than her own. And the vague ideal she had was an educated American gentleman like those who lived uptown. Now, again, we get the sense that the Stroon family are fairly well off. Somebody lower down on the socioeconomic ladder would look at the Stroons and say, I want to be like them. But Flora doesn't really see it that way. She wants to move up on the socioeconomic ladder. I think this would also fall in the category of the American dream. We want to keep moving upward. We want to amass more things, more materiality. And so in this way, this story, I think, falls within that tradition. She says here at the bottom of page 899, just coming from the synagogue, Papa. She greeted him affectionately. In English, this settles your fast, don't it? It is not so easy to settle with him, my daughter, he returned in Yiddish, pointing to the ceiling. You can never be through serving the uppermost. Hurry up tomorrow, he added in the direction of the adjoining kitchen. She speaks to him in English. He responds in Yiddish. What do you think this means? Well, I think that Flora is interested in furthering this transformation into being a sort of regular American girl. Wants to get her English better, like other Americans, let's say. Whereas Azrael, as we have found at this period of his life, has become a renewed Jewish traditionalist, and he responds in Yiddish. And this also might be his discomfort, his unfamiliarity in speaking English as well. So we have maybe this first generation of immigrant having a different set of problems than a second generation of immigrant. So he might be of a certain socioeconomic class within his ethnic community, but he doesn't speak English very well, and he has some difficulty when he leaves this particular area. And we see that played out a little bit later on. Flora is described as meeting him as affectionate, which I think is characteristically Flora, as we've seen thus far. She's a kind-hearted person, and she loves her father, even though she's going to exhibit some very, very much rebellious behavior. He's a little bit grumpy. He's called all throughout this text a bore. He's a little bit grumpy here, and we see that exhibited at the bottom, page 899, when he responds in Yiddish, but at the bottom here, a couple lines further down, you ain't going to say more Thalim tonight, are you, Pa? Why does it cost you too much? He snarled good-humoredly. Okay, interesting. He snarls. What does he also do on page 900? 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs down at the bottom of that short paragraph, his ruddy, gnarled face took on an air of piety. A couple lines further down, off with that lump of Gentile nastiness while holy words are being said, the old man growled. And at the bottom of the page, a few lines from the bottom, Flora, he presently growled, I am going to Europe. So, characteristically, what is this? What is Azrael's personality? He seems to be frustrated, he's worried, he's anxious. We know he loves his daughter. He's a bit of a rough person. Now, does this characterize or generalize a first generation Jewish immigrant? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it just characterizes Azrael. And Azrael is a kind of single parent to his daughter. The relationship, of course, between a daughter and her father, a very special relationship, a very sacred relationship. And there's also, I think, a little bit of discomfort here that Azrael is responsible for all things related to his daughter. He wants the best for her and he loves her. He also does a fair amount of growling and snarling and things like that. In the middle of page 900, off with that lump, as I just said, of Gentile nastiness. While holy words are being said, the old man growled. Flora obeyed in amazement. Only a few months before, she had seldom seen him intone grace at all. She was getting used to his new habits, but such rigor as he now displayed was unintelligible to her, and she thought it unbearable. Now, Flora obeyed in amazement. I think there's a couple ways that we can look at this. Flora obeyed because of the way that her father reacted. Maybe she was amazed at the way her father was reacting. Or another way is to say, here is this young woman who's rebellious. Maybe in amazement, she's amazed that she obeyed her father. So a couple different ways I think we can look at this. And that the actions that Azrael was taking had become unintelligible to her. What does this mean? As Azrael has gotten older, he has become more fearful and more anxious of the future of his daughter and his future, what his future might look like in the afterlife. As a result of this, he has re-embraced his Jewish heritage and Jewish theology. This has produced a further separation between Flora and her father, as Flora is moving in one direction and with her desire to become more American, whatever that might mean. Azrael, while Flora is looking forward, Azrael is looking back. Okay, on page 901, the beginning of section 2, we can look at together. When Azrael Stroon had retired from business, he suddenly grew fearful of death. As I mentioned before, he had accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. Perhaps we can say he succeeded in the American dream. I think we can say that. He came to this country, first-generation Jewish immigrant, became successful in business, had discretionary money, had a nice house, and now he was interested in other things, how he would exist in the afterlife in terms of his Jewish faith. Flora, on the other hand, was also interested in the American dream, but her American dream and her desires are going to take her in a different direction. On page 902, third paragraph, then it was that he grew a pair of bushy sidelocks, ceased trimming his twin goatees, and with his heart, talking about Azrael, divided between yearning after the business he had sold and worrying over his sins, spent a considerable part of his unlimited leisure reading Psalms. What are we being told here? Well, oftentimes, or sometimes, to a greater or lesser degree, when immigrants, in this case perhaps when Stroon came to America, he wanted to dress and assimilate to some degree, and he dressed like other people would dress. Now that he's older and he's re-embracing his Jewish identity, he is allowing his sideburns. These are called payas. If you were to look at images, let's say, and I think I might have a slide of this, of Orthodox Jews, They might have full beards and their sideburns have grown out. Again, these are called payas. And so, if we talk about the separation between daughter and father, this, I think, separates his daughter. The two of them get a little bit more separated. If Flora is interested in becoming more assimilated, and her father is, instead of moving forward in looking like an American, quote unquote, he's looking more like somebody from his native country, somebody that's more orthodox, if you will, than he perhaps had been in the past. And he is becoming more and more religious rather than more and more secular. He had been secular. Now he's becoming more religious. On page 90, still on page 902, a couple paragraphs from the bottom before we get to section 3. This is Azrael. He grew more pious and exalted every day, and by degrees fell prey to a feeling to which he had been a stranger for more than 3 decades. So he had essentially given up his religiousness for 30 years in the pursuit of secular business interests. And now he's returning to his Jewish roots and Jewish theology. In addition to this, and I think, when you get older, and you'll have to take my word for it, or you talk to your parents or your grandparents, you become reflective. You start thinking about things and how things were in the past. And some of you do that now. However old you are, you look back 3 years or 5 years or some other time in the past where things might have been simpler. Memory, nostalgia, loss. That loss never goes away. And the loss of that earlier identity, the loss of things that are familiar, the things that you associate with your youth, perhaps with better times. And how does Struan respond to memory? We are told here, still on page 902, to pick up where I left off reading, Azrael Struan grew homesick. It was 35 years since he had left his birthplace, 30 years or more since in the whirl of his American successes. He had lost all interest in it, yet now in the 58th year of his life, he suddenly began to yearn and pine for it. Was it the fervor of his religious awakening which resoldered the long broken link? What were the reasons that the Struan family moved, that Azrael Struan moved to America? Religious persecution, social oppression, lack of opportunities in a various number of areas. So America was a better place, offered tolerance and opportunity, supposedly tolerance and opportunity in all different cultural and social areas, economic opportunity as well, right? But there's something about the past, something about one's country of origin. It's a lot different today. If you came from another country and it wasn't, let's say, a war-torn country, which makes it much more difficult, but if you moved from, let's say, Ireland, you moved here from Great Britain, you moved here from Australia, are those places far away? Sure, you just can't jump off a diving board in New York Harbor and swim there. Of course you can't. But you can get on a plane. You can be in Ireland in 6 hours. You can be in Paris in 7 hours. You can be to Palestine. It'll take 24 hours to get to Australia, but you can get there. In the 19th century, early 20th century, could you do that? Very, very difficult. We say maybe it's a world away. Could have been on a different planet. Very difficult. Takes money, takes a lot of time. There's even safety issues and those sorts of things. 35 years that Struan has been away from his native country. All right, let's look at section 3. So we're shifting. We are now in Pravli. And so he has made it to Eastern Europe, and this is where the story picks up. On a serene afternoon in May, Asriel drove up to Pravli in a peasant's wagon. He sat listlessly gazing at the unbroken line of wattle fences and running an imaginary stick along the endless zigzag of their tops. The activity of his senses seemed suspended. I think that there's going to be a kind of disillusionment, if you will, between what is going on around Struan and what he imagines things are to be. And by the end of his trip, I think those illusions are going to be dispelled. I think here on page 903, we have, I think, one of the most beautiful passages in this text. One of the most beautiful passages in this text. And I say that, and as you folks have gotten to know me, I like to read passages pertaining to landscape, not just because in and of themselves I find them very beautiful, but because they are often foils to other things in a literary text. Most often, civilization, urbanization, industrialization. In this case, I think the landscape alters an alternative view to living in New York. In New York, it's close, it's loud, it's dirty, it's always moving, it's never sleeping, it's go, go, go. Memory is a lot less of the craziness. And Struan here essentially has gone back in time and is trying to realize the same time and place of memory. Let's read this together. Presently, a whiff of May aroma awakened his eye to a many-colored waving expanse and his ear to the languorous whisper of birds. He recognized the plushy clover knobs and the vast array of placid magnificence, and the dandelions and the golden buttercups, although his poor mother tongue could not afford a special name for each flower. What does this mean? His poor mother tongue could not afford a special name. That he had forgotten the language. That he had forgotten, or he no longer has the ability to name flowers in the language that he grew up with. Separation. Alienation, if you will. And he now addressed them collectively as tatskis, a word he had not used for 35 years. He looked at the tatskis as they were swaying thoughtfully hither and thither, and it somehow seemed to him that it was not the birds, but the clover blossoms which did the chirping. Beautiful image, right? The flora, if you will, the plant life, not just the birds that are making sounds, but this is a kind of Garden of Eden, if you will. This beautiful space that Asriel has returned to, that even the plant life is in harmony with all other elements of nature. The whole scene appealed to his soul as a nodding, murmuring congregation engrossed in the solemnity of worship. How impactful was this experience of being driven on a peasant's cart through this field of clover with birds and flora and things like that? It was one of religious ecstasy. Congregation is something that you would see in a church, or here more specific, a synagogue. And this relates to the happiness of his soul. He felt as though there were no such flowers in America, that he had not seen any since he had left his native place, perhaps where he was living in New York. It was very difficult to get to a place where they had these sorts of open spaces. And of course, as we know, if he had opportunity or desire to go west to more open spaces, he would have seen meadowland and things like that. Echoes of many, many years ago called Asriel from amid the whispering host. What are these echoes? reflections, memory, ghosts. Memory that perhaps had been submerged or buried in his unconscious are now being opened up. And here I think is where the pathos of this story is in part created. His soul, his body, his psychology is happy. It's returned to a place that in his mind of his, place of his youth, his native land is one of happiness. We see a happy Azrael. By the end of this trip, the memory of this place is not reinforced by the current experience, and it becomes one of disappointment, unhappiness to some degree of being in America, being away from his native land, but also unable to return to his native land because he's different. He has been transformed. In fact, the text says a little bit further down, still on page 903 in the paragraph beginning with a wistful babyish look, he became absorbed, taking him back to this earlier time. In the middle of this paragraph, in the middle of the line, he recalls not the place itself, but he can remember his reminiscences of it. So there's a disconnect between memory and place and identity, and all of these things are swirling around. He ends up meeting people, and he thinks perhaps that here's Azrael, the Jewish American, to return to his native country as a successful American businessman, and he should be recognized. And that is not the case. The trajectory of history, or I should say, the history of Pravali has been on one particular trajectory, and Azrael has been on a different trajectory, and he comes back a different person. At the bottom of this page, at one moment he felt as though he had strayed into the other world, at another he was seized with doubt as to his own identity. This is a destabilizing, while it is at once a realization of memory that creates comfort, an infantile satisfaction, it is also one that is destabilizing and creates confusion, instability. And I think these sections here are trying to recapture the identity that one had before and realizing that that person, yourself, your earlier self, is gone. He or she's been transformed. That self is left in the past. On page 905, at the bottom of the second paragraph, he meets a few people here in this section, and he expects them to recognize him, as I said, and they just simply don't recognize him. Here's the great American, the Jewish American businessman, and they don't know who he is. On page 905, at the bottom of the second paragraph, it was Pravali, and at the same time it was not, or rather, it certainly was the same dear old Pravali, but added to it was something else through which it now gazed at Azrael. 35 years lay wrapped about the town. Still strewn feels like Azraelki 13 hairs, as his nickname had been here. Then he relapses into the Mott Street landlord, and for a moment he is an utter stranger in his birthplace. He is at once, this moment here, I think, is summarizing the pathos, the complexity, the division within self. He is at once calling him, he is calling himself by the nickname of his young self, and simultaneously, or in a subsequent moment, he is the Mott Street landlord. He becomes a stranger to himself. He looks at the bottom of that paragraph, he looks at Pravali, and his soul is pining for Pravali, for the one of 35 years ago, of which this is only a reflection. For the one in which he was known as a crack-brained rowdy of a mechanic, a poor devil, living on oatmeal and herring. Okay, so what is going on in this particular section before he returns to America? Well, Azrael brings his American businessman mentality to Old Provly. He begins a bidding war in order to read from the Torah being the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, to go up in front of the congregation and to read is a great honor in the Jewish religion. And him being a visitor, showing up, it's not like he text messaged his old buddies or FaceTime them and told them he was showing up. He's a visitor, and he ends up getting into a bidding war with another member of the congregation. And this, I think, is a really grotesque and it's really a perversion of Jewish theology as it's represented here, that American business mentality is corroding the seriousness and the morality of the Jewish faith. He ends up winning the honor, and he's pays the congregation, the synagogue, and he wins the honor. Page 913. Where the section begins anew. The next morning, Azrael visited the cemetery and was overawed by its size. While living Provly had increased by scarcely a dozen houses, the number of dwellings in silent Provly had nearly doubled. What does this mean? There are more people that are dead in the cemetery that are alive. That Provly has grown by just a few scattered houses, but this is perhaps a dying community that Azrael needed to leave, that he had made the right decision. There wasn't a lot of opportunity here, that more people ended up in the grave. This was not a place of, again, of opportunity. Okay, so on page 915, on page 914, on page 914, Azrael is at the cemetery. And we see, there are a lot of things about Azrael that are frustrating and are discompassionate, and he snarls and he gnarls and all of these sorts of things. I think Azrael is a good person. I think Azrael is frustrated and anxious, and I think Azrael loves his daughter, and I think Azrael is lonely. And I think that as a simple human condition is something, doesn't matter what nationality, ethnicity, religion. I think that's how we can identify with Azrael, this split identity, a desire for the old because the new one has changed, and all of that sort of thing. And we have a particular moment here of pathos on page 914. He is at the cemetery and he's speaking to his father who had been dead for a long time. I am 6 paragraphs down. We are the 35. Some distant tombstones responded, and Azrael could not help pausing to look about, and then he repeated again, 35 years. Can I never see you again, Father? Can't I see your dear face and talk to you as of old, and throw myself into fire or water for you? Can't I? Can't I? Do you remember how you used to keep me on your knees or say prayers with me at the synagogue and box my ears so that the black ear took me when you caught me skipping in the prayer books? Has it all flown away? Has it really? Now, I said earlier on that I thought the relationship between a daughter and a father is a special relationship, a sacred relationship, just as the relationship between a father and a son. And we see Azrael expressing himself to his dead father in a way that perhaps he is unable to express himself to have that kind of closeness in their relationship between father and daughter. Maybe it's because of just simply different personalities. Maybe it's because of their different genders. Um, Maybe it's because they're of different generations. First generation, second generation. One is more American than the other. The other thing that his trip to Provely does is that he brings back a prodigy who is a learned young man in the Talmud, and the Talmud is scriptural interpretations of the Hebrew Bible. And he's a very religious young man, and we are going to see in the next discussion how that is going to play out. So this is the end of part 1.